Does language shape the way we think and ultimately how we behave as public leaders? What if that language and the ideas it contains has been written by white people, white men in the main? Does that have an impact on how society operates? Who is the global majority? I'm here today with three amazing women who've been exploring different aspects of race and culture, which all of us find difficult to talk about. At times, it's given all of us pause for thought and ultimately left us feeling unsure. We are sharing this conversation with listeners in the hope that you can start your own courageous conversations with friends and colleagues. Because unless we're prepared to take that risk, we can't shift anything. In this conversation, we are bound to get some things wrong. We will probably fumble a little, and at times it may be clumsy or awkward. But these women have agreed to come together in what I hope is a safe space to have an open, honest, and courageous conversation. I'm Sherry Malik, and this is the Staff College having courageous conversations about race. Episode 1, The Language We Use Matters. Let me start by introducing my three guests. Rosemary Campbell-Stephens was born in England to Jamaican parents of the Windrush generation. Her career spans more than 35 years in education, and in 2015, she was awarded an MBE for outstanding services to education. She is currently a visiting fellow at University College London, a freelance international consultant, speaker, coach, and author on educational leadership. Rosemary visited Jamaica as a young woman, fell in love with it, and now lives with her husband next door to her sister and her brother and their families, all of whom have returned to the Rock to live a few miles from where her parents were born in Hanover. She's joining our conversation from Jamaica. Kathryn Perera is the director of NHS Horizons, which is part of the Improvement Directorate of NHS England. It provides expert support for programs seeking to achieve large-scale change at local, regional, and national levels across government and internationally. A barrister by background and a current door tenant at 11 KBW Chambers, Kathryn is a US-UK Fulbright Commission scholar. She sits on the external advisory panel of the History Faculty of Oxford University and is a trustee of two national campaigns-based organisations, Campaign Bootcamp and Act Build Change. Kathryn is Irish by heritage and grew up in the market town of Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. And finally, we have with us Jo Davidson, who is the principal of the Staff College since 2018. She has spent nearly 35 years working in schools and local authorities in different aspects of children's services, the last 15 of those as a director. Jo is now engaged in a range of development work to support local authority colleagues in improving systems and, above all, improve outcomes for children and young people. Jo was born and brought up in Southampton by an English mum and a Scottish dad. As a merchant navy engineer, her dad was regularly away for months on end to anywhere in the world, which made Jo feel like she was part of a world as well as a place. Welcome all to this conversation. I'm going to start with asking Kathryn to tell us about hearing Rosemary use the term global majority. Kathryn, what did you think and how did you feel on hearing that term?
Thanks, Sherry. So Rosemary and I happened to be in a session with the Staff College a few months back. And I was fascinated by some of the contributions that Rosemary made as a participant. As a result of that, Jo invited us to have a conversation together to learn more about each other's perspectives, careers, what we were working on, what we cared about. One of the topics that we started to discuss was the use of the term BAME. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, there had been lively debates in the NHS about the use of the term BAME, which, by the way, I loved the fact that my father, who is an avid reader of the Sunday Times, quite elderly, asked me what these Barmy people were that he kept reading about. And I was able to tell him that it was pronounced BAME and not Barmy. So I think there's something about language in that. And he was slightly affronted that I was laughing, but I assured him I wasn't laughing at him. It had just chimed with other conversations I'd be having been having about language. So in our conversation about the term BAME, Rosemary said that she preferred to think of it as Black and global majority. And my honest reaction, my heart sang as me. My heart sang because it feels factually more reflective of where I think we are as a people, a human race. And at the same time, my political brain went, that's never going to stick. And I was feeling both those things simultaneously. So maybe, Rosemary, you could add in here the context to the idea and why you raised it and why you introduced it, why you use it.
Oh, absolutely, Kathryn. That reference to your father really makes me smile, because I had a similarish conversation with my mother, who said she was pronouncing it blame. So she put in an L, and she said, "Are they talking about us?" And I had to explain to her, as you did to your father, what BAME actually means. So that's really interesting about the kind of intergenerational stuff. But yes, Kathryn, I've been using the term global majority since 2003. And essentially, I had been invited to design a leadership program for the University College London that was focused on getting more Black and Asian senior leaders into positions of leadership within London schools as part of the London Challenge Initiative. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to look not just at the content of such a program, but the language. Because for me, I found the terms that were being then used, and back in 2003, it would have been BME, so Black, Minority, Ethnic. They always seemed to minoritize the people that they were talking about. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was that when you looked at the people that we were talking about within the London context, actually they belonged to the global majority if we looked numerically at how those people across the globe were represented. So for me, to be simple, global majority includes Black, Asian, Brown, dual heritage, those people who are indigenous to the global South and have been racialized as ethnic minorities. And that makes the global majority. And when you look at those groups of people, that's roughly 80% of the global citizenship on the planet. So it's not just global majority by a small margin, it's a very large margin. And then for those people who were a little bit concerned about it, I said, well, look, if we look at whiteness as a concept and really discuss what percentage of the world's life was lived through the lens of being white, then it came through to people that actually the global majority are not white. Whiteness isn't the norm for the majority of people on the planet. So that's how it came to be that I started to use global majority in 2003. Yeah. Of course, as Black Lives Matter, resurged in 2020, then it brought to the forefront the language that we're using to engage about race. And so there have been a lot of people who've been saying, right, can we find something that's actually more accurate in terms of terminology?
As you've been talking, Rosemary, I think, it's kind of my brain is zinging from one end to the other and thinking, wow, this really turns everything on its head. I just want to bring Jo in and say, Jo, what went through your head when you heard Rosemary use that term?
I was like you, Sherry. That my immediate reaction was wow, and there were two reasons for that. The first of was, despite thinking that I'm pretty sort of switched on and careful and thoughtful, I rarely consider myself as a minority. And by using that term, it actually brought me up short, and that I am a minority in this world. Mm-hmm. And that brought back to me a few years ago. We went to China, and my youngest daughter was obsessed with something a guide was saying, who kept referring to the Middle West. And my daughter kept, was tugging myself. She's saying, "Where's the Middle West? What are they talking about? Where's the Middle West? I've never heard about it." Well, no, that's because we call it the Middle East. Is that the same? Why are they calling it the Middle West? Again, from this incredibly sort of white Eurocentric view of the world, and it was a real similar feeling to that. So that was my first feeling, and then my second feeling was what an empowering term it is. Because again, in that same way that it causes me some discomfort in terms of how that then makes me feel in my place in the world, equally, it turns on its head everything in the language that is in common discourse today in this country and other white nations, where we constantly other Black people, we minimise them, we call minority and so on. So I was totally on that complete spectrum. And then went through and how would we introduce this then into our day-to-day world? Because I think it's then the conversations you have and the reactions that it causes in other people that I think builds the power of that concept, that language, and so on. And I don't know, because Kathryn, I think you've been trying it out, haven't you? Using the term.
Yeah, I have. I've been trying it out in NHS leadership forums, so using it very light touch. And in the main, it's been received okay. But I think if I think ahead to what are the barriers to using it, or what might be my perceived barriers to using, there is something for me around virtue signaling that I think I'm conscious of as a white person. So for me to introduce a term when another norm of language has been settled upon, and when we are told by the kind of formal parts of the bureaucracy around racial equality, participation, and so on, that they have settled on this term, to use another one, I definitely am aware of a voice in my head, Jo, that says, how do I use that other term with substance in a way that invites engagement, rather than doing it to signal that I'm engaging and looking? So how can we do this as white people in a way that has genuine intent, that creates space for our white colleagues and others to engage and enhance our understanding, rather than it seeming to be used because it's a sign of virtue?
Yeah. Let's unpack that a little bit, because I'd really like to ask Rosemary, and just taking it back to, because Rosemary coined that phrase, why did you feel the need for that? Why did you think that the terms that were around, I know we talked about BAME and blame and balmy, etc., but ultimately from a political context, because that's what I think Kathryn is just referring to here, there's a voice in your head saying, don't do it, because politically it might not be accepted. But, in the context of your getting that term together, why did you feel the need to coin that term now, in this moment? Rosemary?
Okay, Sherry. Well, yes. So one of the reasons why I coined the term global majority was that I was speaking really to those people, in the particular case in 2003, Black and Asian people. So they were my initial audience. And it was really about them beginning to see themselves as part of the global majority and to stop minoritizing themselves. That was the first thing. And the second thing, to speak to the more sort of political angle that Kathryn has referenced, to me, it was really, really key that we stopped minoritizing those issues that pertain to these groups of people, and we started to see them as part of a global conversation. And so the term global majority was about moving in from the margins, those issues pertaining to people that were either minoritized or racialized within local contexts. And of course, in London, it was really key because as part of the London Challenge initiative, the boroughs that were being focused on in London for London Challenge actually had a majority of Black and Asian students and staff. Yeah. So they were talking about minority, and actually they were the majority within those London boroughs, never mind the majority in terms of being part of the global majority. So that really was the reason why I needed that term. And I think those same reasons are still needed today in terms of in 2020, that we need to move in from the margins, the conversations about minorities, because they're not minorities. They're actually part of the global majority. And if we deal with their issues, we're actually going to be dealing with issues that pertain to everyone.
Yeah, yeah. So in the context of Black Lives Matters then, which is really, I think, so key. I mean, it's the defining, one of the defining things that has happened in 2020, apart from the pandemic, is what's happened with Black Lives Matters. Do you think in the context of that movement, how do you think that this term and the way that we're talking now and thinking about race, how do you think that, does it take the dial forward in conversations about race? How do you see that happening? And that's a question to all of you, really. So I don't know. I'll ask Kathryn first to come in.
Yeah, I think there's a combination that's happening, which is interesting. If I bring the health lens to this, between Black Lives Matter as a movement and the COVID-19 pandemic, we know with our head, right, the analysis piece, that the COVID pandemic lays bare starkly inequalities that map so closely to race. And I think it's the combination of seeing that and experiencing it, and experiencing bluntly the death that has come with that, the grief and the loss that has come with that, that has provided energy and fuel and a moment of almost righteous indignation, not just around issues relating to race, but around people saying this time it has to be different. And that what's been interesting about that, I think, is strategically how that has been positioned as something that we all, and in particular white people, because of the privilege and the structural advantages that we have, that we all must act in response to that. That's been felt particularly keenly in, the NHS compared to any environment I've worked in before. And yet, and Jo, maybe there's things that you could contribute here as well from a position of having worked at a senior level for a large number of years in different organizations. There's a nervousness that I observe to know what to do with that. So there's an understanding of a narrative that silence is not an option. There's an understanding of the fact that if we choose not to speak, we are actively reinforcing privilege through the fact that we even have that choice to decide whether we will engage or not. And yet, a hunger to know how we talk about these issues, to want to almost ensure the impossible, which is that we don't misspeak, and therefore a silence that follows that. And it's been interesting to observe how Prerna Issar is a good example of this, the Chief People Officer in the NHS. And she's Indian by birth and heritage. And she says that once it is a privilege for me to have this platform, the most senior person of colour in the National Health Service, and yet that people will look to me always to instigate and to approve the language and to exert leadership on it is also exhausting. I don't know, does that resonate, Jo, with what you've seen and experienced, and Rosemary too?
Absolutely, Kathryn. Very, very similar situation, both from my own experience, but also from discussions with leaders in the sectors that we work with at the moment. That combination of wanting things to be different, wanting not to lose this moment, and wanting to change things, combined with that absolute fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, and being afraid that in talking about it, because language is something that can both enthuse but also alienate, people get very caught up on, I don't really know how to have the conversations even. And I think, you know, one of the most useful bits of advice we've had ourselves is to just recognise that this is a very contested space, language-wise, and that the starting point is to work within your organisation with Black colleagues and talk to them about the language that they want to use. We did a straw poll last week of participants on our Black and Asian Leadership Initiative about the terminology they preferred, and there was a split view amongst that group. So there will be no right way of talking about this, but the important thing is to have the conversation and then to explain why you're using the language that you're using. But I think for senior leaders, I think the other really big issue for people, and it is a luxury that white leaders have that Black people don't have, which is this idea that you can choose to prioritise or not to prioritise discussing race and taking anti-racist action. You can choose to see it as a task. And that is not the situation that any Black colleague can have, because it is with them all the time. And I think that's probably in some ways even more fundamental an issue than some of the language we use. It's the sort of headspace we go into it with. Does that resonate with you, Rosemary?
Oh, absolutely, Jo. Both what you and Kathryn have said resonate and make a lot of sense to me as somebody who is now having much more honest conversations with my white colleagues about race. That's what I've found, that the 2020, the collision between COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter has created a new space where I'm having much more honest conversations with white colleagues about race. And it's really interesting in discussing this conversation that we're gonna have with each other. Sherry made me think about something, and actually the most honest conversation I'm having now are with white men. And I actually feel that I've had more courageous conversations with my white female colleagues over the years that means that we're kind of ready for this conversation now, if you like. But for the white male colleagues that I've had, it's been a completely new, almost, out of the block starting point in terms of being really, really honest about race. So I think that's absolutely key. I think the other thing that I'd say as well is that as Black people, we live our lives through the prism of race.
Mm.
So we're always confronted with the reality of being racialized, from birth through to death. So for us, the language of how we think about our lives, our children's lives, and so on, is always racialized. And so for us, we have been using terminology amongst ourselves, if you like, to try and redress that minoritization and that always comparing to the white norm. And now it's like Black Lives Matter has exposed a light on that. And we're having to have those conversations with our white colleagues and our white friends. So it's like Black Lives Matter has been a conversation from I was born. We've been talking about the fact that our lives don't matter, and that our lives have been used and commoditized to create a sort of third world, like a kind of reservation where we sit, so that the rest of the world can be normal and and just be. And so now we're having that conversation about our lives mattering with the rest of the world, and particularly with white people.
Yeah.
But Black Lives Matter is just a term that for us has been there forever, because it's been part of our narrative.
Yeah, Rosemary, I was really interested to hear that. I think that in your conversations, you feel that the most interesting conversations, courageous conversations you're having is with white men, and that white women are ready and they have been primed and working towards this for some time. But more generally, for all of you, as you go out into the work that you do with leaders across public sector or even internationally, I just wonder, do you think if you'll get any pushback or resistance when you introduce this term in big settings? I know there's always a kind of a warning in your head to say, shall I introduce it here if there's an accepted term already? How do you think that we will take this conversation and the term global majority beyond this discussion that we're having today into really practical ways of embedding it in everyday use and thinking, so that it may have an impact that will change things? What's the pushback and resistance you're anticipating, and how are you going to overcome it? This is for all of you. So, Kathryn, maybe from an NHS perspective, start first.
Sherry, I was also interested in what Rosemary was saying about the conversation with women. And I think we could all make different guesses as to why it might be anecdotally that women feel more ready for that conversation, which relates to our own oppression on the basis of gender and sex. But there's an interesting point within that, I think, for white people, which is when I feel nervous about these conversations, when I feel discomfort, when I feel a fear that I'll be misunderstood, one of the things I fall back on is to remember that I contain multitudes, that I am a white person who has white privilege, and I am a woman, and I am the mother of dual heritage children, and I think if we can access the multitudes of our own narrative, regardless of whether those relate directly to Black experience or Asian experience, but they relate to a sense of the other, I think it equips us to almost bridge in empathy and respect respect for the experience of this conversation that we're sharing here. And that is not to say it's analogous, but it is to say that when I try to imagine, which is all I can do, what Rosemary has described of living a life that is racialized by others, I can touch back to those moments. In 2010, I stood for Parliament, and in my hometown and in one of the final hustings, members of the English Defence League came and questioned me about whether I was a Paddy or whether I was a British candidate. You know, for me, they're moments. They're not a lived reality day to day, but they're enough of an insight that if I focus on them, how they felt, how I responded, that I can develop some empathy that supports me in this conversation. So maybe as a practical thing, that's something that all of us can do that will help. In terms of the pushback, do you know, part of me wants to say on that, let's see. Rather than try and preempt all the barriers that are the reasons why we can't tell stories like the stories I've just told, why we can't use the term Black and global majority. Let's see, then let's come back in 6 months and see whether we got that pushback and talk about how we equip ourselves better for the next phase of remaking those stories, remaking that language, rather than getting too fixated on how I think white men or whoever might react. Because in a way, I guess, I feel like that might be another form of othering. And when Rosemary talked, you didn't talk about white men as a block. You talked about people who were choosing through discomfort to engage in what you're saying. And I think that bit of respect for us as individual people is really key.
Yeah, thank you, Kathryn. That was I really like that. Let's see. That's a great attitude. It's almost like bring it on, because this is the right way to go, and you have the courage to say, let's see. Yeah. Anything from you, Jo, on that?
I'm with Kathryn on the let's see. I think language matters. It's so important, and the discomfiture, but also empowerment of the term global majority, I think totally lends itself to introducing a different type of conversation about language. So it's out of the academic sphere, it's out of the issues that people get very caught up in, which is, I don't know what the terminology of the moment is, which is going to be best to use, or am I sounding very old-fashioned now if I'm talking about something else? I think because it stands on its own merit in so many ways, it's a phrase that we should use as a means of having the conversation about language, but having the conversation about race as well. So yeah, that's where I'm going with it.
Thank you. We're out of time here, but it's been a really interesting conversation, and I just want to thank all of you, particularly Rosemary, who brought us this term, that global majority, that we could have this conversation around language and how we use the language of global majority in the work that we do, and start to shift the dial on some of the conversations that happen in our everyday life and work. Thank you, Rosemary Campbell-Stephens MBE, Kathryn Perera, and Jo Davidson. If you've enjoyed this podcast, listeners, tune in to our second episode, Leadership Paradigms.